There was a time when Britain didn't lose power. It expected to. Lights off, silence, and everyone just nodded. Almost as if to say, "Ah, fair enough." It was a strange, unspoken agreement between the entire country and the national grid. There were no texts, no push notifications on your phone, no scrolling news alerts. There certainly weren't any groveling apologies from the power company. The lights just went out, and that was that. You didn't complain. There was no one to complain to, and even if there were, what would you say? The thing that happens all the time has happened again. It was futile. So, you adapted. The transition from light to dark was met with a strange, almost theatrical efficiency. It felt like every house in the country was part of a secret society, the Order of the Emergency Candle. Within seconds of the television screen blinking into oblivion, drawers creaked open. Dusty boxes were retrieved from under the stairs, and matches were struck. Nobody ever seemed to know precisely where the candles were stored, but they were always found, as if by instinct. And just like that, the nation glowed, one flickering wick at a time. It was a soft, warm, slightly spooky light that changed the entire mood of a room. It was the official lighting of British resilience. With the television dead, a new king was crowned. The battery-powered radio, a chunky plastic box, often kept in the kitchen, would be brought into the living room with great reverence. Switched on, it would crackle to life, a comforting voice cutting through the sudden quiet. More often than not, what you'd hear was the shipping forecast. Dogger, Fisher, German bite. Southwest, veering northwest, 4 or 5. Occasional rain, good. It didn't matter that you lived 100 miles from the sea and had no idea what a dogger was. The calm, monotonous rhythm was reassuring. It was a voice telling you that somewhere out there, in the cold, dark sea, things were still proceeding in an orderly fashion. And that, emotionally, helped a great deal. Now, a power cut presented a significant logistical challenge, but it was never, ever an excuse to let standards slip. The most important ritual of British life had to continue, uninterrupted. Somehow, tea was still made. Nobody can quite explain the science behind it. Perhaps it was sheer force of will. Kettles were placed on gas hobs with a determined clatter. Milk, that was already teetering on the edge of turning, was poured with a hope and a prayer. But a cup of tea appeared. It was a non-negotiable. It was the fuel that powered the nation through the darkness. It was a quiet declaration that even without electricity, civilization would endure. Holding that warm mug in the candlelight, you felt a sense of profound victory. For children, power cuts weren't an inconvenience. They were magical. The sudden darkness was a signal that normal life was suspended. It was an invitation to adventure. Bedtime was delayed. Homework was forgotten. It was a time for ghost stories told in hushed voices, their scariness amplified by the dancing shadows on the walls. It was a time for shadow puppets that looked suspiciously like your dad's hands. And of course, it was a time for torch games that were absolutely, under no circumstances, allowed indoors. But which happened anyway. Behind the scenes, parents were quietly panicking about the contents of the freezer. But for the kids, it was pure, unadulterated brilliance. A mini festival in your own living room. While the children saw magic, the adults saw a test of stoicism. The official grown-up response was to declare the situation quite cozy, isn't it? This was usually said through a slightly forced smile, while mentally calculating how many hours the frozen peas had left before turning into a regrettable slush. A strange stillness would descend upon the adults in the room. Everyone sat very still, almost holding their breath, as if sudden movements might somehow use up the remaining electricity in the air. It was a performance. A collective agreement to pretend that everything was perfectly fine. that sitting in a cold, dark room was a delightful way to spend an evening. It was all very British. The silence was the strangest part. With no television chattering away in the corner, no hum from the fridge, the house became unnervingly quiet. You were left with nothing but the flickering of the candles and conversation. Actual, face-to-face conversation, which, after years of being accustomed to the background noise of evening television, felt slightly strange, almost illegal. You'd find yourself talking about things you hadn't discussed in ages, simply because there was nothing else to do. You'd look at your own family, illuminated by candlelight, and see them in a new way, without the bluish glow of a screen. It was both intimate and deeply awkward. Then, just as suddenly as it had vanished, the power would return. There was no warning, no slow build-up. One moment, darkness; the next, a blinding, brutal flood of electric light. The main ceiling light, a bulb you'd always considered quite dim, would suddenly feel like an interrogation lamp. The television would burst back to life mid-sentence. And what was the reaction to this miraculous return to modernity? Was there cheering? A round of applause? Of course not. There was just a quiet, collective sigh. And someone would inevitably say, right then, candles were blown out with a sense of duty, and normal life resumed without a single word of celebration. The adventure was over. Power cuts in Old Britain weren't exciting. They weren't particularly dramatic. They were just a thing that happened, an interruption to be dealt with, not a crisis to be panicked over. But looking back, they represent a peculiar kind of national spirit, a quiet, stubborn refusal to be defeated by a minor inconvenience. Britain carried on. It carried on with tea, with candles, and with a deep, abiding sense of mild irritation. It was a shared experience that bound people together in the dark. If you enjoy remembering these quiet, slightly odd bits of British life, then you're definitely in the right place. Thanks for watching.